afternoon to everyone. Welcome to our second webinar on carbon sequestration cycle. This time is dedicated to measures, carbon farming, and standards. As always, I, Claudia Costa, coordinator of the Food for Sustainability Academy, will be leading this session. And as you already know, I'm assisted by our dedicated team that I will very shortly present. So we have Ana Rita, our MA Microbiology. Rita, hello. Daniela Fonseca, our PhD in Sustainable Chemistry. Hello, Daniela. And Silvia Moreira, our PhD in Food Science. That we all together make these weekly webinars possible for you. So we have a very interesting session today, and our session will start from the scientific perspective on how we can measure soil organic carbon from the work that Professor Pete Smith has been developing in Aberdeen University. This will be followed by a hands-on project by climate farmers who are committed to make carbon farming a reality at a large scale. With us, we'll have Philip Barker, the founder. And finally, but not least important, we have Verra, a standard certification agency that sets the methodologies for greenhouse gases measures. Viridiana, which sheds some light on how such projects come to life. I thank you all deeply for your presence here today. So let me just remind you about some of the house rules. Questions are welcome. These webinars are much more interesting when we hear from your questions. So I'll kindly ask Daniela to let our participants know how they can take part in our session today.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar in carbon sequestration. If you have any questions, you just need to go to the chat and write down any questions you have. Please just write the name of the speaker to which the question is addressed to, so we can to get them to the speakers. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Daniela. This webinar will take about 1.5 hours and will be recorded for later viewing. So if you do not wish to appear, please just keep with your camera off. Rita, can you please let our audience know where to find our webinars recordings?
Sure, Claudia. It is a pleasure. Good afternoon, everyone. All our webinars are on our website, and I will post the link in the chat. I wish you all enjoy today's conversations. Thank you.
Thank you, Rita. Thank you for your assistance also. So before we start, I will just again ask Rita's assistance to share a very short presentation. As we always do, we start by contextualizing some of the ideas and some figures just for an introduction to our topic. So Rita, you can kindly, thank you so much. I think that you all can view the presentation now. So what we know is that there has been a growing interest in better managing soils. And with this point in mind specifically to increase soil organic carbon content. It's quite established by now that this will assist climate change mitigation, will enhance crop resistance to climate change, and probably most importantly, will underpin food security systems. So Rita, if we can go to the next slide, please. In this slide, what we want to bring into perspective is the roles that soils play in this activity of storing and sequestering carbon. So overall, globally, soil organic carbon represents a stock of around 1,500 to 2,400 gigatons of carbon in the top meters of soil. And if we just look to the lower estimates in this range, this is approximately 3 times the stock of carbon in vegetation and twice the stock of carbon in the atmosphere. So it becomes very clear that small changes in the carbon stocks in soil can have a significant impact on the atmosphere and therefore on climate change. So it's very important that we, hit the next slide, please. So it's very important that we look deeply into this issue. And if we take particularly the role of agriculture in the stock of carbon, and according to estimates from Sunderman in 2017, what we've seen is since the beginning of agriculture, 8,000 years ago, the soils have lost around 140 to 150 gigatons of carbon, which is equivalent to an average of 525 gigatons of carbon dioxide. And so what we have been discussing in our past webinars is that we are trying to promote better farming practices that can restore at least part of this carbon that has been lost. And this is why it has been suggested that the soil carbon sequestration could be a significant greenhouse removal strategy. What Smith has called in 2016 the negative emissions technology. So soil viewed as a technology is very interesting, or even a carbon dioxide removal strategy. But the challenge is that the estimates of this ability of soil to sequester carbon, its potential varies considerably. But according to a recent review from Fuss and colleagues, it has been suggested that the potential for the annual sequestration of carbon dioxide ranges between 2 to 5 gigatons of carbon dioxide per year. What is probably less encouraging is that the economical potential, they lie pretty much on the lower level of this interval. So while for the environment the potential is higher, we still lag in terms of its economical potential, and this really is a challenge. And the reason why, Rita, would you kindly move to the next slide? And the reason why is because soil organic carbon content cannot be easily measured, as we will see. And this is actually an important barrier for implementing such programs for soil organic carbon at a larger scale. So it has been argued that what we need is a credible and reliable measurement for monitoring, reporting, and verification of the carbon that is being sequestered, while both for reporting at the national level and to bring some transparency to the emissions trading markets. Although this is not easy, what we have witnessed, Rita, please, the next slide, is that for the last couple of years, we have witnessed the creation of carbon stocks. The voluntary credit market is already a reality, and we have witnessed the potential for farmers to earn an extra revenue. So we have just here a very short video to see how this all works. Rita, would you be too kind to play the video?
Bayer and Nutrien have recently added their names to a growing list of businesses that will help farmers earn money to implement carbon sequestering practices. ESMC, Indigo, Nori, and others seeking to cash in on the emerging carbon market are joining in as well. In fact, Indigo has publicly stated that they believe there is a $15 trillion chance to sequester carbon for farms. In addition to sequestering carbon, practices such as no-till strip-till, subsurface nutrient application, and the use of cover crops, among others, help increase organic matter, reduce erosion, and improve soil resilience. So, what should you know as a landowner about this market and the implementation of these practices? Here are 3 things you should pay attention to regarding carbon markets. Number 1, capturing farm data. Capturing farm data along with having good records is essential to begin participating in the carbon market. A farmer or landowner must demonstrate that they have implemented a practice that sequesters carbon to earn a loan, underlining the importance of collecting quality farm information. When capturing farm data, there are 3 ways in which information can affect you as a landowner. Before you can enroll in any program, you must have a baseline of what practices have been previously used on the farm. If at any time you switch farmers, the new farmer must be given the historical records outlining what practices were previously implemented on the farm. It is also important for the farmer to know which program, if any, the farm has been enrolled in so that they can continue maintaining the previous practices and earn credits. If you're successful within the carbon market, it will have an impact on the overall value of your farm. If you are ever looking to sell your farm, make sure you have the records of participation or non-participation in carbon credit markets for the farm to be valued fairly. Number 2, impact of carbon credits on lease income. How should you integrate the carbon credit revenue into your lease agreement? There is no easy answer, and the answer depends on what kind of lease arrangement you currently have with your farmer. With a farm plan, it is important to set expectations of renewal so that your farmer feels comfortable taking the risk of implementing. This puts the burden on you to periodically renegotiate with your farmer and be knowledgeable about how carbon credits affect cash rent trends because their value fluctuates. If you are in a crop share or a flex lease, carbon credits should be considered as another source of income that is shared between landowner and farmer. Generally, we encourage people that aren't industry experts to avoid crop share arrangements due to their complexity, but a flex lease can provide shared rewards. Flex leases can incentivize your farmer to adopt regenerative AG practices and enable you to share in the upside of both the carbon credits and the improved asset value that results from the adoption of sustainable practices. Number 3, evolving value of carbon credits. The success of the carbon market is unpredictable, but is gaining momentum. Today, carbon credits range from $15 to $20 per ton, but there's speculation that the price could grow to as much as $50 per ton. Perhaps more importantly, the practices they promote will have a very real impact on the value of your farm, as there is now increased focus on the long-term benefits that these practices create. A more resilient farm with high organic matter should sell for more because it's more productive and has lower input costs. However, if you ever plan to cash in, make sure you have the data to prove it. Want to learn how you and your farmer can earn carbon credits for your farm? Give us a call.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much, Rita. And as we seen in this video, I think the video has stopped. This is not easy, and this is not an off-the-shelf project that we can just give to farmers to implement. This takes commitment, this takes knowledge, this takes a long-term approach towards farming. So there's a lot of variables and learning process that are here involved. So in this session, we will aim to discuss the potential and the barriers of soil organic matter evaluation by linking this with farming practices and opportunities available in the market. So I will now handle to Pete Smith, that has been looking to how we can better measure soil carbon content for a few decades now. But just before I do that, let me just briefly introduce you to Pete while Pete uploads his presentation. So Pete Smith is a professor of soil and global change at the Institute of Biological and Environment Sciences at the University of Aberdeen. As we all know, this is Scotland, the UK. And he is also the Science Director of the Scottish Climate Change Centre of Expertise. Peter has been an author of many reports for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and led its work of climate change mitigation in agriculture, forestry, and land for its fourth and fifth assessment reports. And its work led to interlinkages between land-based mitigation options for the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land. Pete is also a fellow from many Royal Societies, beginning with the Royal Society of Biology, fellow for the Institute of Soil Scientists, for the Royal Society of Edinburgh, a foreign fellow of the Indian National Science Academy, as a fellow for the European Science Academy, and a fellow for the Royal Society, which you all know is based in London, a very reputable institution. Its interests include climate change mitigation, soil, agriculture, food systems, ecosystem services, and modeling. Pete, thank you so much for being here. I now hand the floor to you, and let's hear the experts talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Thank you for that introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about soil carbon sequestration and give you an idea of the potential and some of the barriers. And I'll just finish up with some of the challenges for monitoring, reporting and verification that Claudia very usefully introduced. So the first thing to note, I can't get this to move on. There we are. The first thing to note is that soil organic carbon stocks are depleted in croplands in particular. So they're also depleted a little bit can be depleted in grasslands, but it's in the croplands where we have the greatest potential. So if you have a look at the slide over on the right, this is just from UK soils. You can see that the cropland carbon stock in this histogram over here on the right, the cropland carbon stock is much lower than the grassland stock and the woodland and the semi-natural stock. And that's because since it's been ploughed up, many centuries ago, it's lost between 40 and 60% of its carbon. So there's a great potential, because it's lost a lot of carbon, there's a great potential to increase soil carbon. And you can see on this slide over on the left, this chart by Guo and Gifford. This gives you the pasture to crop. You have about a 60% loss in soil carbon, that one line from the bottom. Forest to crop, you have about a 40 to 50% loss of soil carbon. But when you convert crops back to plantations or forestry or pasture, then you gain some of that carbon back. But it's not only by these land use changes that are shown in this diagram. There are crop management practices that can also increase the soil carbon, and some of those were shown in that video, but I'll go through a couple of them in a moment. So this was a paper that we published in 2016 in Nature, the journal Nature, called Climate Smart Soils, which looked at the global potential for soil carbon sequestration to make our soils climate smart. So we talk about climate smart agriculture, but you can also think about climate smart soils. And this is just an example of a decision tree for actions that you can take depending upon what the baseline condition is. So we have things like degraded or marginal lands. You can convert them to perennial vegetation. If you've got cropped organic soils, peatlands, you can restore the wetland. If you've got nutrient deficiency, you can re-add those nutrients and lime. If you've got excessive bare fallow, you can grow cover crops, reduce vegetated fallow fields. And if you've got excess N fertilizer, you can reduce the N fertilizer, so on and so forth. I'm not going to go through this, but there are a number of options which can reduce greenhouse gas emissions and also increase soil carbon. And also in this paper, we estimated the potential. What's shown on the graph in the bottom is the per area potential. So this is the tons of carbon dioxide that can be stored per hectare per year. So on the bottom, with a very large potential of up to 50 tons of CO2 per hectare per year, is restoring histosols. So that's our peatlands. So restoring peatlands has a very, very large potential. But the reason it's at the bottom is shown up on this, on the y-axis, is the area that the practice that occurs. So degraded peatlands are only around 10 mega hectares around the world. So they've got a very high potential, but a small area. And at the other end of the graph, with a smaller potential, less than 1 ton per hectare, grazing management and cropland management, but they occupy really large areas, maybe about 1,000 million hectares or mega hectares. So there's this balance between practices that have a lower potential but can be applied on large areas, and practices that have a high potential but that can only be applied on relatively small areas. But when we add all these together, we come up with a technical potential, as Claudia said, of about 5 gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year. And to put that in context, our global carbon dioxide emissions or greenhouse gas emissions are about 50 gigatons per year. So it's about 10% of our annual emissions. So the potential is quite significant. And as Claudia also said, the economic potential is lower. It's a little lower, between 1.5 and 2.6 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalents every year, that can be realised at carbon prices of around about 20 to 100 US dollars per tonne of CO2 equivalents. So the economic potential is a little lower, but still very significant, because as we all know, there is no magic bullet to stop climate change. We have to reduce our emissions rapidly and aggressively in all sectors of the economy, but we're also going to need some carbon dioxide removal, CDR, and soils can represent a negative emission technology that can help us offset some of those emissions that still remain after we've decarbonised society. And as has also already been mentioned, it doesn't only benefit the climate in terms of mitigation, so that's reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere. It also helps improve resilience, so it can improve adaptation as well, and it can also sustainably increase productivity. So this is some data from Rattan Lal, and this is the increase, the crop yield increase that you get with every 1 tonne of increase in soil carbon. So for different crops, we have maize, you could maybe get an extra 100 to 300 kilograms per hectare for every tonne of carbon that you increase the soil organic carbon. For soybeans, a little lower, but it's always positive, as you can see in all these graphs, all these crops. And if you add them all together, there's the possibility of increasing yields by 30 to 50 million tonnes per year, just in developing countries. So this has a really important sustainable development role in helping to improve productivity of lands, to improve resilience of the lands, and also contribute towards sustainable development, particularly in developing countries. And when we look at all the ecosystem services that soil carbon supports, we can break down the soils into if you think of this as a pizza, the inner ring of this pizza are the soil functions. So when you increase soil organic carbon stock, you increase biomass production, you store and filter pollutants, you improve biodiversity, it's a source of raw material, it's a carbon pool, and it's an archive of ecological and archaeological heritage. So these are the functions that soils provide. What we can do in the middle ring is we can have a look at the ecosystem services that are supported by those functions. This is the ecosystem services that have been defined as the nature's contributions to people by IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And you can see that what's shown in the little circles, the little green circles, are the corresponding soil functions that contribute to those ecosystem services. So you can see that there's not a single ecosystem service, nature's contributions to people, that isn't contributed to by one of these soil functions. So it's really important for underpinning the ecosystem services upon which we as humans rely. We rely upon nature to provide us. We can go one step further and we can map how these ecosystem services help deliver the Sustainable Development Goals. So in the outer ring of the pizza, I've just listed the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and shown in the grey circles are the ecosystem service that contributes towards delivering, for example, zero poverty, zero hunger, good health and well-being, and so on around the ring. And again, you can see that there's not a single Sustainable Development Goal that isn't in some way underpinned by improving our soil health. So this is a really strong message that by improving our soils, we're not only benefiting the climate, but we're benefiting a range of ecosystem services, in fact, the whole range of ecosystem services, and we contribute towards the Sustainable Development Goals. So there really is no reason why we wouldn't do everything that we can to improve soil quality. A few caveats, however, just so that it's not all positive, you have to think about the limitations as well. The first is that carbon sequestration in soils is time limited. For the first 10 years that you do soil carbon sequestration, you get quite a big increase in soil carbon stock. So if we're thinking about a cropland here that we've improved the management, we've done it for 10 years and we've increased the soil carbon stock really significantly. For the next same period, say another 10 years, there's a decreasing return on that increase. So you still get an increase in soil carbon, but it's gradually getting smaller. The next 10 years, it gradually gets smaller until you reach a new equilibrium position when the soil has a higher soil carbon level, but then the net annual removal is zero. So the amount of carbon that's taken in and fixed through photosynthesis coming in from the plants is equal to the amount of carbon that's lost through soil respiration. So at that point, maybe after 20 to 50 years, the soil carbon is no longer increasing and you're no longer removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's the first limitation. You have to remember that soil carbon sequestration is time limited. It will only last for about 20 years, after which you have to continue doing the good management practice, but you couldn't claim any carbon credits for doing so then because you've already increased the soil carbon as much as you can. The second one is that it's non-permanent. As with all biological sinks, you can increase the soil carbon. There are two examples here from applying manure and for converting a cropland to woodland. That's shown. This is modelled data, but it shows what happens then when you convert that land back to low input cropland, and you lose all of that carbon that you gained really quite rapidly. So the carbon credit has to really reflect the fact that you've got carbon that's stored for a while, and you have to continue a practice out into the future so that you don't reverse all of that carbon and release it back into the atmosphere. And the last thing that we need to think about is leakage or displacement. So if we're over here on the farm on the right, we've got a mixture of manure and mineral fertilizer is being applied. But we then decide to put more manure on the field on the left. That means that we've got a situation where we're putting more manure on the field on the left, but we're putting less on the field on the right. And if we measure the field on the left, we'll find that soil organic carbon's going up. And if we only focus on that field, it would seem like we're doing a good thing. But we also have to measure the field on the right, because that field will then start losing organic matter because we've removed the manure. So the net benefit could actually be over the whole cropland area could be zero. So we have to think about the displacement effects. We can't just measure the fields that we're improving. We have to also measure all the fields to make sure that we're not losing carbon on those fields. So that's just a few caveats so that you don't go away with the impression that soil carbon sequestration is a magic bullet. It does have many co-benefits. It can deliver a lot of soil carbon sequestration. It can deliver better adaptation outcomes, improve productivity, but there are these limitations which mean it's not the perfect option. The main thing that stops us from moving ahead more rapidly with soil carbon sequestration, because it seems like a great idea, is the difficulty in measuring changes in soil carbon. When you think about planting trees and creating a woodland, you can just see the trees growing. Every year you can see the trees have got a bit bigger. You can even go and measure them with a tape measure around the stem, and you can see them getting bigger, and you can estimate the carbon that's being sequestered. That's really quite straightforward. With the soils, you can't see the change in soil carbon. So you may be able to see some of the impacts of it, like increasing productivity, but you can't actually see that change. So you have to go and measure it. So one of the biggest drawbacks is measuring, reporting and verifying soil carbon, which we looked at in this paper in 2020. And what this did is it proposed, because it's difficult to measure soil carbon, it's a small change against a very large background of soil carbon. It's difficult to go and measure all the carbon that we want to claim, because the cost of doing so would be it would cost more to demonstrate the change in soil carbon than the carbon would be worth in terms of carbon credits. So it's not feasible to go and measure it physically everywhere. So what we need is a verification system that includes all the data that we already have. So all the data, all the technologies that we already have, we could bring them together to make a monitoring, reporting and verification system that we know would work. So I'll just go through them very quickly, because I've talked for long enough to talk for too long already. There are long-term experiments around the world, several hundred of them around the world, which measure changes in soil carbon under different management practices. We can use those to estimate changes in soil carbon, and we can also use them to develop and calibrate our models, to use models to project out into the future. We can use short-term experiments like flux measurements, which are measuring carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas fluxes. These tend to be shorter term, and they measure fluxes on a daily basis, or maybe even an hourly basis, and we can also use those to improve our models. The models are shown over here on the right. We've got a range of models at our disposal that have been developed over many decades and do quite a good job of simulating changes in soil carbon. We can either use them to develop emission factors, so that we can, or stock change factors, so that we can estimate what a practice does, what impact it will have on soil organic carbon, or we can use it by running them spatially with spatial data to estimate what's happening in a real spatial way. So that's a so-called tier 3 methodology. We can estimate our changes. We need spatial data to drive those models if we're going to take that approach. And importantly, we also need the activity data. So this is where the farmers' records come in and are really important. We need that management data to know what the soil carbon change we would expect, and we also need it to drive the models. So we need the farm and field level data, the self-reporting by the farmer. So this is where the farm records of the management practices that have happened. What fertilizer have you applied? When did you apply it? How did you apply it? What yield did you get? When did you plant the crops? What type of crop? All those things that farmers regularly record. We need all of that information to determine what's going to happen with soil carbon. Then there are these resampling systems on survey grids that are undertaken by national organisations generally. So these occur every 10 or so years, where the agencies go back and they remeasure carbon. And lastly, we have the remote sensing, where we can use remotely sensed data to firstly verify the activity data. So if a farmer says that they're doing zero tillage, you can take a look at a satellite and you can tell if that's actually happened. Or leaving residues on the surface, you can see that from satellites. And we can also use that information to help as inputs to run our models to determine changes in soil carbon. So all of these exist to some extent, but they haven't been brought together into an effective monitoring, reporting and verification system for soil carbon. So I would argue that one of the biggest challenges for making the best of the scientific knowledge we have would be to bring together all of this disparate information into a form that could be used to predict changes in soil carbon for farmers. So in summary, there's great potential for soil carbon sequestration, especially in croplands, but also in degraded pastures. There are so many co-benefits of soil organic carbon, increasing the levels, for example, the enhanced ecosystem services and the delivery of the Sustainable Development Goals. But, and those caveats I showed, sink saturation, reversibility risk, and leakage risk are disadvantages compared to greenhouse gas emission reductions. So we shouldn't think that soil carbon sequestration is going to solve climate change. It's not. We have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in all sectors of the economy very, very rapidly. Soil carbon sequestration can help in that, but it's not a substitute. And the biggest barriers to implementation are monitoring, reporting and verification. I've shown a scheme where we proposed a way to get around that. And the other one, I think, is the collectivization of farmers. The individual farmer doesn't have enough carbon to sell on the carbon markets, really. Nobody's going to be interested in investing in one farm. But if farmers can collectivize and come together in bigger organizations, then they may have a few thousands of tons or millions of tons of carbon to sell, which makes them an attractive proposition on the voluntary carbon markets. But Viridiana is here from Verra. She's going to be talking. She's giving after a talk from the farmers, which is great. I'm looking forward to that. Also, Viridiana from Verra will talk to us about how this is being implemented by companies that are actually helping farmers to sell carbon credits. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Pete. Let me thank you for a truly fascinating presentation, and congratulations on the work that you have been developing for decades now. It's truly fascinating. Just before I turn to the audience, I would like to return a question to you that you posed during your presentation. So it becomes very, very clear to everyone that we need to do something about the amount of carbon dioxide that's in the atmosphere, and the climate change mitigation. We start to understand that the role that soil plays in this mitigation, but the truth is that we are still facing a challenge, and we haven't really the right answer. You mentioned during your presentation the soil monitoring, reporting and verification scheme or methodology, and it was quite clear that the technology is already all out there. So it's not a problem of technology. So my question, and I know that you suggested that someone should bring all this information together. And my question to you is, how do you envisage this platform, or who would be the Google of the soil sequestration, so that this practice can actually be scaled up, and that they can be, massified towards that really have a very strong relationship with the soil?
I would like to see this developed by public bodies or by national governments, so that this was available to all, so that farmers could use it just by entering their location. They could access all of this information. So from my own personal perspective, I think it's a public good. Reducing climate change is a public good. You can get, obviously the farmer can make profits from it, so private goods associated with the carbon, but this is good for everybody. Carbon being sequestered by farmers is good for every citizen. So in my opinion, this should be publicly funded, and it should be openly available to all. FAO, through their RECSoil programme, have already started a system which is modelling soil carbon that's being done from the bottom up. So individual countries are opting in. There's a methodology that they can use, a modelling methodology that can estimate how much carbon can be sequestered. So each individual country is not being done top down, telling countries what their carbon is and how it can be changed. It's being done by the countries themselves, and I think that's a big step forward. It's used that methodology that I outlined. It doesn't have all the components in yet, but it's a start. And I think that that will start to form a database and a data set that we can all start to use in the future.
And do you think that that can be taken at an individual farm level? Because what we see is that we still need a strong economic incentive towards this more regenerative practices.
Yeah,
So
with the sort of level, with the resolution that we have for modeling and also with remote sensing, that could easily go down to the level of an individual field, let alone an individual farm. So I think if we did this in a smart way, it could give us that sort of spatial resolution that could then be used.
Okay, great, fantastic, Pete. Thank you so much. So let's turn to our audience. So we have a question here from a Pete in Portuguese, which is Pedro. And Pedro is asking, how many actors per resampling survey grid?
So resampling survey grids are usually done by the National Soil Survey. So in the UK, we have one. In fact, each individual country in the UK has one. So Scotland has a separate one from England, which has a separate one from Northern Ireland, for example. So they tend to be funded. They're publicly funded agencies, sometimes by the Ministry of Agriculture, I guess. And they go back and they resample these the same spot every 10 or 20 or 30 years. So this exists in the UK. I think also there's a similar situation in Portugal, but maybe they haven't done so many resamplings. And it's done on a gridded basis. So sometimes it's done by stratifying by land use type. It's a stratified sampling, and sometimes it's just done on a regular grid. But that varies between countries. But this is the sort of thing that is done by the national agencies, and that data can be very useful for checking out your models. You know, that's the verification component of it. If your models are projecting a change in soil carbon, you go and do the resampling and you're not getting a change in carbon in your cropland, then you know you've got a problem.
Okay, thank you so much. We also have a question from Daniela. So, Professor Pete, in your opinion, for the case of Portuguese farmers, which you have probably not a lot of knowledge, but they are mainly small farmers, how can we make this reporting easier? Aggregate data from specific regions, for example?
Yeah, so I think farmers collectives is the way to do this, because farming is done on a small scale. You have to get lots and lots of farmers together. So it could be done by a municipality, or it could be done by a region, which together would collect all the information together from the farmers and collectively try and sell that carbon on voluntary carbon markets, or even to help Portugal not sell it, maybe. So sorry Veridiana, maybe they wouldn't sell it. Maybe it would be just for individual countries contributing to their nationally determined contributions, to reduce their carbon emissions to the atmosphere. So that would be a way that it could be done. But that sort of collectivization is really important, and it shouldn't have to put an extra burden on the farmers. The farmers are already having to collect most of this data if they're receiving any funding under the Common Agricultural Policy. So the smart thing to do is to use the data that's already collected, that the farmers have to collect to get their single farm payment, and to use that data in the monitoring and reporting and verification system. So I think there's hope there, no matter what the size of the farm is, by collectivizing the farmers across a region, or even within the same type. Maybe all the organic farmers would go in together and all the conventional farmers would go into a different group. There's different ways to do that, but it could be done.
So it's also a question of, culturally to change the mindset, the way we work, work as a team. Yeah. And in Portugal, that is, sorry.
Yeah, cultural, and it's also to do, it's to do with governance and institutions. Do we have the institutions to help farmers to do that? Maybe in some region of the world, there aren't those sort of institutions or governance structures that would allow that. But I think Portugal, there would be, and it's just a cultural thing. Yeah.
Okay, good. We have also here a very interesting question from Danielle. I'll probably leave this one to all the speakers at the end, and we'll just finish with one comment. Professor Piet, can you comment on the cost factor for measuring in situ measurements? And if we could take this, apologies, I could not see that it's up. And if we would take this country government-based approach, how granular data would we require? So if we are measuring in situs, how much we need in terms of resolution of the data. You're muted, Piet. You're muted.
Sorry.
We cannot hear you.
Sorry. Yeah, you need lots of samples. You need to take lots of samples per hectare because soil is quite heterogeneous and it can vary quite a lot between different spots. So you need quite a lot of samples, and you're probably looking at a minimum cost of sort of €5 per sample, and it can be quite a lot larger than that to send your samples off and get them analysed. So quite quickly you get into a situation where the cost of measuring the carbon is greater than the carbon that you could claim from the credit. That's why we need to have these systems that don't rely on measurements for every single thing you do. Maybe you need to take one baseline measurement, you do a soil sample at the beginning, and maybe you have some measurements at the end after the carbon has been paid for, after the carbon credits have been paid for, just to check that it's been done. And I'm sure Viridiana can explain how things like buffer pools work. So that you have buffer pools, which is a certain amount of carbon that's held back, so that you can use that to balance any sort of like where you think you're going to get an increase in soil carbon, but you don't quite reach the amount of carbon that you use. So there are sort of mechanisms to do that. But you need quite a large number of samples. But the idea of this MRV system, this monitoring, reporting and verification system, is we already know, as scientists, we already know which practices increase soil organic carbon. So we know that if you adopt conservation agriculture, residue return, you use cover crops and catch crops and these sorts of things, these are all practices that increase soil carbon, and you can model the change. So all the farmer would have to do is measure what they've actually done. They'd have to record that, and we could use that. It's called activity data. It's a jargon, but it's just activity data, management data. That means that you wouldn't have to measure soil carbon every year or every 2 or 3 years. You could just measure it at the beginning and at the end. But I'm sure Viridiana could give a much better explanation of this. So I'll leave it to her.
Viridiana, get ready for very tough questions from Piet. Thank you so much, Piet. There was wonderful insights that you just gave us. I hope you can stay with us until the end. I would like to return to that question, but now let me turn to Philip, which he is a world record holder. Just listen to this. So Philip supports regenerative farmers in Europe in their important work of regenerating our soils through climate farmers. Furthermore, Philip studies and experiments with regenerative culture and regenerative leadership. Before this, Philip embarked on a path before embarking on this path to regeneration, Philip worked for 5 years in business and community development for different startups, ranging from sharing economy with PureBuy, over electronics with Fairphone, to software, which was his last employee, Ritual Technologies. And now it's the thrilling thing about Philip. Since 2009, Philip is a world record holder in simultaneous fire breathing. Wow, we need to run a webinar on that one day, Philip. And he's also part of ASHCOA's Changemaker community, Viva Con Agua, and the Love Foundation, an NGO with 500 members worldwide that Philip co-founded in 2013. Philip, thank you so much to be here. It is a pleasure to have you here, and I now hand the floor to you. You can share a presentation, switch on your micro, and welcome.
Oh, what an introduction. Yes, thanks a lot, and thanks a lot for the for the first presentation, Piet. I was nodding my head a lot, and it felt really good to to hear that. Yeah, academic backing for I think a lot of things that we're sharing a lot of thoughts. So my presentation will be a lot more on the, let's say, the practical side of things, how we can really help farmers in the direct work. Can you see my screen? Can you see the tab?
Yeah, but it's not full screen, Philip.
Yes.
You can still see the window, the Teams window.
I think that's the problem with Adobe. If I go full screen, you can probably not see it. So I think this will have to do.
Yes, it's fine.
It's okay.
Okay, cool. So yeah, I think we touched up on the beginning already. Agriculture is right now one of the main causes of climate change, actually, with 24% of all greenhouse gas emissions, and it's responsible for basically us crossing a lot of the planetary boundaries. At the same time, regenerative agriculture can be a solution to many of these megatrends, especially the things at the moment which are happening, like the rising fertilizer costs, water shortages, biodiversity crisis, CO2 emissions. All of this can be tackled through regenerative agriculture. It has the potential of preparing our farms for the effects of climate change, so it makes farms more climate resilient. It increases farm productivity in the long run. It captures carbon, builds biodiversity, and reverses erosion. The problem is we're not doing it. So we have about 10.5 million farmers in the European Union. When we started with Climate Farmers in 2018, we estimated that there was a few thousand doing regenerative agriculture. Now it might be in the 10,000. There's no exact number, but it's definitely only a fraction of all farmers. The reason for that, in our opinion, is twofold. The one thing is we're missing the role models. So the regenerative agriculture movement in the last few years largely came from America, with the leading people being Gabe Brown, John Kempf, etc. And in Europe, we don't really have a lot of farms where farmers can go and can get inspired. So what we believe at Climate Farmers is that we need to get 10% of all European farmland under regenerative management, and then we will have an avalanche effect. So when we have these role model farms where other farmers can go and they can see that it works in practice in a context similar to theirs, then they will also start to join on the path to regeneration. And from there on, we believe that we can scale regenerative agriculture to hopefully being the norm and not the oddity out anymore. The other factor that we need is basically to make the regeneration indicators measurable and to start paying farmers for it, especially financially, because most of the time, farmers are unfortunately financially in a bad situation and dependent on subsidies. In order to make this happen, we believe that there's two issues which are there on the way. The one is knowledge and the other one is finance. For that reason, we have two parts of the Climate Farmers. So one is our non-profit, which is the Climate Farmers Academy, which deals with the knowledge side. And then we have a for-profit part, which deals with the finance side. On the knowledge side, we see two issues. The one is the mindset. So basically shifting the mindset to one of regeneration and farmers to see the farm in a holistic context and to be aware of basically the effects that climate change will have for them and the benefits that regenerative agriculture can give to them, and then also to give them direct support and how that transition towards regenerative agriculture can look in their specific and individual context. On the finance side, we are looking at, on the one hand, monitoring the regeneration aspect, and on the other hand, enabling payments from society for this, either through subsidies or through payments from the private sector. We are basically have been working with farmers, and we grew a farmer community of about 600 farmers in 2020 and 2021. And based off some pilots that we have been doing and some experiments with these farmers, we created basically certain projects which we're running this year, which we believe would bring most value in order to come to the scaling of regenerative agriculture in Europe. So that's very important to say. Everything that I'm saying is very specific for the European context. That's a context where we really dove into in order to see how we can scale Regen Ag here. First one is the farm enterprise analysis. So I already touched up on it. There is a lot of basically possibilities nowadays out there for analyzing farms, especially through remote sensing. We agree on that one. So one thing that we're working on, for example, is a tool right now in order to assess the effect of climate change on individual farms. The idea is if a farmer can see the individual effects on his or her farm in regards to climate change, then we can create a regenerative scenario that mitigates those risks, and through that start to basically convince more and more farmers to engage on this path to regeneration. The second one is community as a service. So we grouped our 600 farmers in local WhatsApp groups and in the European-wide Slack community, where they're exchanging best practices with each other, where they support each other, and where they basically help each other on the journey which they're on. Because a lot of farmers which are working regeneratively are surrounded by conventional farmers, which usually call them crazy for the stuff that they're doing. So we realize that the support communities can be something that gives them a lot of value and a lot of strength in the sometimes hard transition period while they're building up the soil health again. Another thing is basically a platform of European consultants on regenerative agriculture. We encountered in the last 2 years very often the situation that there's a lot of, let's say, not so qualified consultants with very shiny and fancy websites, which are easy to find, and very amazing consultants, which do not have the time or energy or willingness to create a fancy website, so they're hard to be found. So we created this consultant platform where our consultants are rated by farmers every time they are consulting through us, so that farmers can relate to other farmers which have worked with these consultants, and through that can find a verification method for the individual consultants. Another thing that we have created is the transition blueprint process, where we basically look at the mindset and the individual context of the farmer. We see who are the different stakeholders of the farm. We see where they want to develop in their personal lives. We come from that to the farm business context. We look at what is working on the farm, what is not working on the farm, what is the business plan, is there at all a business plan? And then we look at the ecological context, what is the soil quality, what is the rainwater situation, and afterwards we match them into the peer groups and we match them with our experts in order to start designing experiments, what a transition could look like. These we usually do on a yearly basis with a build, measure, learn approach, so we continuously learn together with the farmer what can working and what is not working. Another thing as already touched upon by the professor is MRV. Here we especially believe in satellite images and in also scientific analysis based on the data which we have already. We're lucky because we have a very close collaboration with Wageningen University in the Netherlands for the soil data, and with the ETH Zurich in Switzerland for the satellite data, in order to be able to basically measure and calculate what's happening on the land and how regeneration is taking place. From this, we're currently working on creating a fully valorized regeneration credit. So we really want to raise the attention to the fact that it's not all about carbon. There's many positive benefits from regenerative agriculture. These rate from water infiltration and soil water storing capacity, which, for example, could have mitigated the floodings that have happened in Germany and the Netherlands in the last summer. It also increases biodiversity, and it increased nutrient density of plants. There's now the first studies that have been coming out from the United States about regenerative source produce having more nutrient value than organic or conventional produce. And then, of course, there's also the already touched upon carbon storage potential. Generally in everything that we're doing at Climate Farmers, we're looking into collaborations. We're looking at what are the barriers which we have for scaling regenerative agriculture, how can we remove these barriers, and how can we collaborate basically in order to make this so necessary transition towards regenerative farming practices. And that's it.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing your views. It is indeed notable, the work that you are developing. I am aware of some of the work that you are doing here in Portugal. So congratulations, it's inspiring. And before I turn again to our audience, just to have one question. At some point, you have mentioned about 3 key challenges to become a climate farmer. And we really feel this here in Portugal. First of all, to be a farmer is not sexy. So young people don't go into farming. That's a challenge. Then there's very few knowledge about regenerative practice, about the potential for carbon sequestration, the benefits of the practice and the benefits, and also very importantly the questions of funding for this transition period. And you mentioned that it's very important to get these early adopters. Once we get this 10% of early adopters, then we will, be in mainstream towards carbon farming and regenerative agriculture. So, which do you think of these points is the most important to address first? What advice from your experience?
I think we need all three of them. I mean, generally, we try to think in a holistic way and in a systemic way at Climate Farmers. And I think if you just address one, you will not get very far. So the first thing that we started with back then, it was we picked the name Climate Farmers, and our whole storytelling on the website and on social media is designed around the fact that we think farmers, and especially regenerative farmers, are the heroes of our times. Because what we have happening at the moment is due to the fact that farmers are not giving the credit which they deserve. It's not attractive for young people to go into farming, and farms are dying out in our generation. This has been changing already in the last 2 years. A lot of basically effort and results have come also from Kiss the Ground. We were working on a movie ourselves, and then this movie came out on Netflix, and you might think what you want. It's very American, but it did a job. It definitely put regenerative farming out there, and we see a massive increase right now in that group already. And the biggest potential that we see here actually is basically my generation, or so people in their 20s and 30s who are children of farmers and who left the farm and who didn't want to take over the farm and who are now returning and telling their parents, hey, I take over the farm, but only if you let me do it my way and if you let me transition it to regenerative agriculture. Because people in their 50s and 60s, they're not going to change their farming practices anymore. They're not going to change it anymore. So I think we need these young people in order to make that transition happen. But at the same time, if we want them to do this, we need to empower them with knowledge, because if they don't know how to apply regenerative agriculture, and if they can't learn about regenerative agriculture, how are they ever going to get started with this, right? So we need to work with universities together. We need to basically provide the knowledge for them to be able to make the transition. And then we have the issue, if you start a transition from conventional to regenerative agriculture, you need to build up soil health. That period usually takes 3 to 5 years. In this period, in the transition period, you will have less produce, you will have less profit. And if we can't cover up for that loss of profit, then we can also not expect anybody to make the transition. So I believe all three things have to happen basically in order to scale regenerative agriculture.
So from your experience, are you having a higher take-up from people that are already doing some more sustainable practices, let's say organic or biological, or do you still find interest from people that want to start from scratch, from conventional agriculture to straight away to regenerative?
So the interesting thing is that very often, so the two main groups that we are seeing which are transitioning, as I said, is either young people which are taking over the farm of their parents. This could then be organic or conventional, or it's people in crisis. Because people, if they really see this is not working anymore, fertilizer prices increased 800% in the last 12 months. Fuel prices are increasing right now, and they were already not profitable before. And their soil is already depleted, and they have no more nutrients in their soil. So the conventional farmers, they are suffering more already, which means they're usually more ready to transition. And we have a lot of situations where we talk to organic farmers, and they're like, but I'm organic. I'm doing everything perfect already. How could I do anything more than organic? So they don't realize that being organic is not the holy grail. If you're plowing and you're an organic farmer, you're still destroying the soil life, right? So in the end, regenerative agriculture is all about building soil health, and organic agriculture is a part of the journey, but it's not the whole whale. And unfortunately, the mindset of a lot of organic farmers is already that they're doing everything right. And the mindset of a lot of some conventional farmers is by now, oh, what I'm doing is not working out. I need to make radical changes. And then regenerative agriculture can come in and basically show them the way.
Yes, and definitely, and the price of, all the inputs increasing has definitely opened a window of opportunities for at least to start the discussion, at least to have people looking into alternative systems. And, as the Norway, they have the saying that nothing is ever so bad that no good comes out of it. So at least we have that. Thank you for your answers. We have a question here from Rosano, and he asks you, Philip, did you notice so far any differences in adoption rates of regenerative practices in different countries and or cultures? For example, do you feel there's different rates between the North and the Southern Europe? Do you have a track of where it's happening in terms of Europe?
I would not say so. I think practices are happening everywhere. If there's a little bit of a tendency, then I would say we have more holistic management farmers in Southern Europe, simply because it's a more brittle system. So you also see a higher impact. So we work, for example, with several farmers in southern Portugal and southern Spain. And here, with the right animal management, you can achieve amazing results in terms of regeneration of soil. And that is definitely stronger in southern Europe because you have less rainfall. So you have more issues again. So you have more need to do it. But generally, regenerative crop management, agroforestry, and also holistic management is practiced by a minority of farmers all over Europe.
Yes, so you notice that where the pressing points are higher,
Yes.
than and probably the ones that already adopt extensive grazing, they are already more aware that it's probably easier, that transition. It comes more natural.
Yeah.
Okay, it's just to do it, slightly different. So the tools and everything, it's a less complex system. Just one final question, just a clarification. In terms, you mentioned funding, Philip. Funding is also very important, especially for this transition period. How does it work within climate farms, or do you think that funding is something that it's the responsibility of the government, or the policies and the incentives that should be attributed to farmers? Do you have a specific funding opportunities for those that are starting the path of this transition path?
So I mean, in a perfect world, right, it would be the responsibility of the government, and the common agricultural policy would be giving out funding based on regeneration taking place on land. Unfortunately, we don't live in a perfect world, so we're not there yet. And we are working with. We have a very big luxury now that the German agricultural minister is now from the Green Party. So we're working with the German government on this, and we're also working with the EU government in order to hopefully be able to influence the next development of the CAP. And this will be the large scale thing, right? Most farmers have 60 to 80% of their income coming from subsidies. And subsidies right now are mostly given out based on size of the farm and just on amount of hectares, not on your practices. This needs to change. We would love to see subsidies being given out based on outcome and based on regeneration taking place. Until we get there, we're exploring several different routes to go there. One of them could be loans for farmers that are in the transition process. For example, because after 3 to 5 years, once you successfully transitioned and build up soil health, there are a lot of studies that show that you are more profitable as a farmer. You just need to bridge that gap. So we're working on collaborations, for example, with Ecosia, which is basically a search engine, which is financing planting of trees for farmers.
Mm-hmm.
We went to this event together at Francisco's farm with Life Terra, which is an organization which is financing trees for farmers in order to help them in the transition process. And we're also working with Carbon Plus credits in order to finance the transition for farmers. Here again, unfortunately, we can only work with large-scale farms, starting at a minimum size of 50 hectares, because we're working with remote sensing technology, and this is very difficult to do on small-scale farms.
Mm-hmm. Okay, interesting. At least you point avenues for funding opportunities for farmers, which is already. So, and where can we find climate farmers, Philip? So those that are interested, where can we find you?
In what way? We're operating in 16 countries in Europe. Focus points are definitely for us Germany, Netherlands, France, Spain, and Portugal at the moment. And otherwise, I mean, we're findable on the website, social media pages. If you just type climate farmers into Google, you will not have a difficult time finding us.
Okay, great. That's fantastic, Philip. Thank you so much for your insights. It's been great. I hope you can stay a little bit longer. And I would now turn to Viridiana. Viridiana, let me just present Viridiana. She's a senior program officer. She supports the development and implementation of VCS, which are verification credit standards for agriculture methodologies and projects, providing technical input on greenhouse gases measurement in agriculture, and explores opportunities to promote regenerative agriculture within various other frameworks. Prior to joining Vera, Viridiana supported the international 4 per 1000 initiative on soils for food security and climate in her function as desk officer at the Federal Office for Agriculture and Food in Germany. Before that, she worked at FAO in Rome as land and water officer. Here, she supported the Global Soil Partnership and further projects on sustainable soil management around the world. Viridiana also worked at the Tunen Institute for Climate Smart Agriculture, where she led a 3-year research project on carbon sequestration in forest and cropland subsoils. Viridiana holds a PhD in soil science and a diploma in geoecology. Viridiana, thank you so much for being here. I can see that you are all set, so the floor is now yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the kind introduction and also for the invitation. It's my pleasure to be here with you and to speak along with Pete and Philip. It's really great. Thank you very much. I have a little bit of a cold, but I hope you can understand me well. Yeah, so I will share a bit of our work in agriculture at Vera. And just to say upfront, I think some of the things I want to say have already been said, and others will probably need more discussion, but we're always open to have further calls or further discussions with anyone who's interested. Yeah, just to set a bit the scene again, reminding us what are carbon credits and offsets. So if you think of a balance, on one side we have these heavy greenhouse gas emissions from industries and countries also. And on the other hand, we have projects that are achieving GHG emission reductions and removals. So carbon would fall into the removal category. And these projects basically can provide tradable certificates for the reductions and removals they are achieving to companies that have these GHG or are causing these GHG emissions. So one tradable certificate for each ton of CO2 equivalent. And in turn, these buyers of credits provide, of course, the climate finance for these projects to run. It was mentioned a little bit, but I actually added this slide while Pete was speaking, just to make clear what is the role of carbon markets and what is their vision and potential. If we see the overall mitigation we need, it's around 30 gigatons to reach 1.5 degrees by 2030. And compared to that, we see here 3 gigatons that are the projected carbon credit issuances in the voluntary carbon market by 2030. So you see it's, more or less 10%. And by 2021, it was only 0.2 gigatons. So what I want to stress here is carbon credits and carbon markets do not aim to solve the whole problem of the climate crisis. It's only a small part. And we like to describe it as a transition tool. And actually our rules are also written in that way. That should help towards a decarbonized economy, but it's always supposed to be part of a broader strategy, either for one single company or also in general for society. Their aim is to catalyze climate action. And once it becomes more broadly adopted, or what we call a common practice, then it's actually not qualifiable anymore as a carbon market activity. And in the same context, we, although of course we deal with carbon credits and offsets, we still always remind ourselves what the mitigation hierarchy and priority is. So for companies, and actually most companies that engage in offsetting and buy carbon credits, they have this as a part of a broader strategy, and they first focus on avoiding emissions in their own activities. Yeah, also related to what Philip said at the end related to the cap. The reason why the voluntary market works and it's gaining traction is because of insufficient government action. So that gives kind of a window of, or not window of opportunity is a more positively framed, but it's like a gap where private finance and private action plays a role in many cases. So we see many corporate leaders taking action. And also for companies, when they have a large GHG footprint, that also affects their liability and their image. So that's becoming ever more important. In this context, I want to share some key principles of carbon credits. So we call them at Verra verified carbon unit, but each standard has their own definition or their own name. And yeah, again, one verified carbon unit, VCU, is 1 ton of reductions or removals in CO2 equivalent. And they are we are very strict about what VCUs should be. And here you can see this list. So they should be real, measurable, permanent, something Pete touched upon, and we can discuss more about how we monitor permanence and how we manage non-permanence risk. And key features also additionality, which is what I mentioned, that a practice is only able to credit when it's not common, when it's really it can really demonstrate that there is a need for climate finance. And on the other hand, is very important that these emission reductions and removals are independently verified, transparently listed to avoid double counting, same as uniquely numbered, and conservatively estimated. That means when there are certain uncertainty ranges, you always go with the lowest estimate of emission reduction so that you don't over credit and have too many too high issuances. The carbon market is a pretty complicated space, but to kind of simplify who plays a role, which actors. On the one hand are these, what I mentioned, project developers who are supplying the GHG emission reductions and removals, but also, of course, communities where these projects take place. And in many cases, local NGOs are involved, or also bigger NGOs. Then we have the GHG crediting program, like the VCS, which is run by Verra, who does this function of independently verifying that the reductions are actually occurring. And after issuance of credits, there are certain intermediaries like brokers or trading platforms for the credits. And on the right side here, we have the demand side, which is the buyers basically of the carbon credits. So that's companies, corporates, philanthropies, NGOs, or in some cases, individuals. So what do we do at Verra? We run several standards that enable financing mechanisms for, initially it was only focused on GHG reductions and removals, but now we have kind of expanded to all sorts of environmental benefits and also other sustainable development goals. We have close to 1,800 projects registered in our registry, and about 920 million VCUs have been issued so far, which is more or less the equivalent to 200 million cars taken off the road for 1 year. We are a nonprofit organization established in 2007, and our main program or flagship program is the Verified Carbon Standard, the VCS, which is the world's leading GHG crediting program. So I mentioned we have now other standards that have more or less other functions like the Climate Community and Biodiversity Standard, or the SD Vista, which is a Sustainable Development Standard, and very recently in the last years, the Plastic Waste Reduction Standard emerged. And they all follow more or less the same principle, but of course focus on different aspects. And yeah, in all these programs, we measure environmental and also social impacts, and we have very strict safeguards regarding like no net harm to communities, for example. So how does this verified carbon standard work? We have basically three key elements. One is our accounting methodologies. They define how to set the project boundary, baseline scenario, how to demonstrate additionality, that there are different ways for different contexts, how the monitoring procedures should be for each target achieved target emission reduction and removal, and how to quantify the outcomes. Then we have an independent audit through what we call validation and verification body. That's basically an from us check that the projects are really doing what they report to us. And we have about 20 approved, and they are also independently accredited. And all is summarized in our registry system, which is a secure, publicly accessible platform. You can all access it in this link. And there we track all the projects, all the credit issuances, and also when they are retired. And in addition to this program, we can combine the VCUs achieved here with adaptation or climate adaptation, community biodiversity credits, and other benefits related to the SDGs. So how do we address agriculture in the VCS program? We have a number of agriculture methodologies, and I will list here the main ones. BM42 is the latest methodology we have for improved agricultural land management, has a focus on soil carbon quantification, but of course considers the entire greenhouse gas balance and also other carbon pools like trees. I will speak more a little bit about this one in the next slide. Then we have to, so BM42 is more or less focused on cropland, but it's actually very flexible for a broad range of farming systems and practices. We have two older methodologies on sustainable grassland management that's focused on improved management of animals and rotation, but also on improved fire management. So it's for very specific ecosystems. The 126 focuses more on soil carbon, and 32 more on methane reduction through better fire management. Another one is VM22, which focuses only on reducing nitrous oxide emissions through reducing fertilizer rate. And we're currently revising this one to make it more holistic, not only in terms of reducing the amount of fertilizer, but also how is really fertilizer applied related to 4R best management practices, and of course adapted to the context. So all of these focus on the generation of credits through monitored and verifiable N2O, methane emission reductions, and CO2 removal through soil carbon stock increase, and to a minor extent also increasing the carbon pool in trees, for example, in agroforestry projects that's allowed under BM42, but it's not so widely used so far. Just to mention, we have also further methodologies, but they're maybe, I think, not the focus for this group. One is more like an experimental one, BM41, that's focused on reducing enteric methane emissions through adding different feed ingredients for livestock. And one that is about to be released is on biochar. If you remember, biochar was one of the big bubbles in the one graph that Pete showed regarding mitigation potential from agriculture. And yeah, we're very excited about this one. The interest is very large for biochar projects. Sorry, and the methodology will include 3 stages, which is sourcing of biochar, producing it, and then applying it to the soil. So I'll say a little bit about measuring and monitoring soil carbon, but in our methodologies, but this is something we could talk about for hours and hours, and it's what makes the most of every day of my work. So just to summarize, we have basically 3 options in our different methodologies. One is measure and remeasuring soil carbon by comparing a project site to baseline control sites. The second one is a combination of measuring and modeling with biogeochemical models. And we provide a strict calibration and validation guideline for these models and also for the data to be used. And their use is also required to be independently verified by a modeling expert. The third one is a purely modeling approach with a pre-validated model. In this case, it's RODC, which is used in methodology 17, which I haven't mentioned before. And this is one that has been used largely in smallholder projects in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa. So this is, although there are problems with this methodology and we want to revise it very soon, but it's more related to like how the baseline is set. But we do acknowledge, as Pete was saying, that it's not feasible for all contexts and for all projects to require measurement. And especially if you go with smallholders and you require that you really measure each field, and one project integrates 10,000 or maybe 50,000 farmers, then we realize that that's not feasible, and we want to still provide an option for these projects. But in order to bring this kind of like up to date with the latest science, we're always consulting with experts and with researchers working in the field, providing us advice of how can this be credibly done. An important thing to mention is that we always require, I mean, not only in agriculture methodologies, this is for all of the VCS methodologies, that there's always a deduction depending on how uncertain the measurements are. But this is something that is quite important also for soil carbon, because you can never reduce the uncertainty to 0, right? As you know, depending on how much, how much like budget you have for measuring and so on, and how heterogeneous your soil is. So yeah, this is a way to kind of compensate that and make sure we don't overcredit. A few technological opportunities I will mention that we try to slowly incorporate also in the methodologies is first the use of more cost-efficient spectroscopic measurement techniques like infrared technologies or also laser-based spectroscopy. Then it was mentioned a couple of times, remote sensing supported stratification, and also tracking of farm activity data, both for, let's say, on our end or more on the side of this independent auditor, that they can really verify that what is provided by the project developer is really matching the farm reality, but also for project developers, because if they work with thousands of farmers, they cannot really check, even if it's digital data, they cannot go to every farm every season and check that that's really what they're doing. So that's what we've heard from some project developers, so they can like cross-check and use more automated techniques, and that increases efficiency and lowers, of course, costs. Another interesting development we've seen is the use of robotics to lower sampling and laboratory costs for soil carbon measurements. So that's pretty exciting. And of course, we always rely on the scientific advances in biogeochemical models. There's so much going on, and Pete can talk more about this, but this is something that is for us extremely important to always keep track and it always gets a bit more complicated, but it's interesting that also now like service providers arise that provide these modeling services to projects, and then they enable this, like using this knowledge, although it requires a high expertise. Yeah, to finalize, I want to share just like some future developments for carbon credits, which we're working already at Verra, and other standards are working on too. We are scoping or developing a Scope 3 intervention program, and Scope 3, it's also sometimes called like supply chain program, focuses on not so much or moving away from offsets, so that companies buy some credits that are generated in, I don't know, the Amazon or somewhere really far away where they have nothing to do with it, but trying to bring them back to their own activities, even though it's not related to exactly their production, but more like what they affect in or in an indirect way. So, for example, if a food company is selling coffee, and they don't always engage with each single farmer how they grow that coffee, and they would invest, instead of in a reforestation project in the Amazon, they would invest in their own coffee farmers and help them to improve or to embrace regenerative practices. Then this would fall under this project. We're starting to work to quantify how these supply chain interventions can be made and accounted for in corporate GHG inventories through our BCS methodologies. Key issues we want to solve is identifying ways to scale investment. There's a lot of opportunity here because, for example, if one intervention is falls in the scope of two different companies, and they are able to kind of co-invest and both fund these activities together. So that provides a bit more funding opportunity. We need to improve traceability to make sure that we're counting correctly where the reductions come from. Of course, it's very important always to avoid double counting, to know like where is it credit going? Is it going for a company? Is it going for a country? Is it being sold? And this will hopefully also create some flexibility for corporates to decide where they want to invest. So this is exciting work in progress, and the biggest opportunity of this is definitely in the agriculture sector. And one key issue here to mention is also that stuff like additionality will not be so rigorous anymore, because it's not so much about really having this catalyzing function and incentivizing at the beginning of a transition. It's really more about helping the companies to really reach net zero. Look forward to sharing more, maybe 1-2 years. And that's all I have for now, and I'll be happy to discuss a little bit more with you.
Thank you, Viridiana. What a great presentation, and so open about the challenges and the opportunities and the vision for the future. Find it very interesting to make the corporates or those stakeholders more accountable to their emissions, so bringing them closer to where they want to compensate. So you just don't buy a piece of reforestation very far away that we don't know. Just work with your community, with your supply chain. It also makes it more commitment, I believe. So thank you for your presentation. I'll probably, because we are a little bit run out of time, I will have a question that first for you and then for Pete also. I would like to bring back the question of time limitation, time as a challenge, and time as a opportunity for carbon sequestration. And as we've seen from your presentations, that the number of years that carbon actually remains stored is very susceptible to be challenged by climate variability, land use, and other management practice. So Pete has pointed to a plateau, but we know that there are a lot of factors that probably prevent us from reaching that plateau. So I would like to start to hear from you, Viridiana. How do you monitor this permanence, and how do you evaluate the risk of this non-permanence of carbon in the soil?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that question. So firstly, we have crediting periods for projects. So that's when they implement their activities. And beyond that, we ask that they continue monitoring practices to ensure that they are not reversed. For example, with tillage, that's very easy to kind of track, that they ensure that if they implemented no tillage in a project, to make sure that not 1 year after the project ends, the farmers will till again and then everything is lost. So yeah, that's one way. And we are currently transitioning to a digital supported and also remote sensing supported monitoring system that goes even longer. We aim for 100 years. And on the other hand, we have a buffer pool, which Pete mentioned. So every project has to calculate their non-permanence risk. That's how we call it. And we have a non-permanence risk tool to calculate it. So depending on different factors, which include also sometimes things like how secure is land tenure. And now we also did an update regarding projected also climate changes and how that can affect the region where the project is located. And based on that, there is like a score which gives you a number of or a percentage of credits. For example, 30% of the credits you achieved have to be or are not allowed to be sold. They have to be stored away in our buffer pool. And then each project or each AFALU project is required to do that. And in case there is a reversal in your project, you're of course obligated to report that. And then those buffer credits are canceled. And yeah, that's how we hope to kind of compensate. So like one project would compensate another one in the worst case.
Mm-hmm. So you provide the risk management factors, so to make sure that you don't inflate the market. Just one small question. So for your agriculture projects, how big is the areas that you require? I know Pete mentioned a lot about communities and working together. Again, let's see if this is applicable to Portugal or if we are talking about the entire country.
Yeah, so we don't have any requirement or like a minimum of size area, but these decisions are made like by the project developers. When is it worth it to really develop a carbon project? And so far, I can tell you that the projects we see is mostly like 10,000 of hectares, or rather more, hundreds of thousands. And yeah, it depends a lot also, of course, on the carbon price and on the monitoring costs. So that also relates to which monitoring approach are you following and where are your credits coming from? Is it more on the side of reducing fertilizer, for example, or are you only basing your project on soil carbon gains? Then you may have higher costs. And mostly projects combine these things. Mm-hmm. So it's we see very little projects focused on only one carbon pool or one GHG source. Mostly they combine, and then they can also have like in a timeline different income sources, right? Because like emission reductions happen immediately, right? If you reduce N2O emissions, you can credit that on the first year already, and soil carbon you may only able to detect that after 5 or 10 years. So that's how they find the balance.
Okay, great. Just one clarification. When you mention projects, and what sort of institutions you are referring to? So it's kind of this big NGO that was set up for carbon sequestration project. Is it a branch of a corporate that really for, corporate social responsibility effects or reporting? So some clarification on who runs those projects?
Yes, mostly it's actually a mix. So there are companies dedicated to develop these types of projects, but there are also, or I would say like bigger companies, but there are also small consultancies that support, for example, NGOs developing a project like that, and then they build a consortium. And in many cases, I have to say that they do have some kind of funding support, either through a development agency or an agricultural support agency, or also philanthropies, for example, support at least the initiation of these types of projects. So,
okay,
yeah.
Thank you for the clarification. Professor Piet, one question that still remains here. The time course of carbon sequestration shows a plateau in carbon saturation after 20 years. Considering the climate change and desertification that soils are experiencing, should we expect that longer time is needed to reach carbon saturation? Have you accounted for this?
I don't think so, because that would reduce the capacity of the soils to store carbon. So it wouldn't just be it wouldn't sort of elongate the time that they would get to saturation. They'd probably get to saturation at a lower level because their carrying capacity for carbon would be lower. So I think, it is an issue about carbon saturation being a one of the drawbacks of soil carbon sequestration. But on the other hand, we're trying to get to net zero by 2050. We need to get to net zero by 2050 to hit the 1.5 degrees Celsius Paris target. And to do that, that means that we need to be removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, as well as reducing emissions in the next 20 to 30 years. And that's the exact timescale over which soil carbon works, and indeed afforestation and anything else. So I think its time is really now. We should be doing this now. Even if it saturates after 2050, we've got time. That gives us time. That gives us the 30 years we need to decarbonize the rest of society. If we start losing some of that carbon at that time, after that time rather, we've already decarbonized society. So it's relatively small amount. So we can manage that. We can manage that sustainably. So it's really about buying time, getting us to where we need to be by mid-century. And the fact that we mentioned the reversibility, you have to remember that any biological pool is reversible, not just soil carbon. With the Californian forest fires that went up, the buffer pool that Veriana was talking about was completely wiped out by that forest fire, because all of that contingency in the 20% buffer pool, it all went up in flames. So all that carbon went up in flames, and the buffer pool was exceeded. So maybe we'll have to reassess our risk assessment, or have bigger buffer pool sizes as climate change kicks in. That's something that may be a reality, but I still think carbon sequestration, either in vegetation or in soils, is a viable option to help us get to net zero by mid-century.
Okay, that's great to leave some words of hope. Just before going to the last question, to both of you, what advice would you give to us as consumers? What can we do to contribute to the carbon neutrality that European or decarbonization that the Europe so much desires by 2050 as consumers?
You mean in just for agriculture, not in general as consumers?
Yeah, I would say in general, as you know, an advice that I could pass on to my parents or to my children, a practice that we all do every day that could be, you know, small contribution, you know, to achieve this goal.
Oh yeah, that's a tough question. I think one of the most important things is really to learn about climate change, like where is it coming from, what is the background of it, and then as you do that, then you start realizing which everyday action you can do, right? Like you start buying more local things, or you Philip mentioned organic is not always the best, but you know, looking at certain labels in the products, or going to your local farmer, using less plastic. So I think the list is very long, but I think it all starts with education and really understanding what is behind climate change.
Yeah, good advice. Thank you. Pete, do you have any other views?
I do. I would say fly less, obviously. Use active transport more. So do less driving and walk and cycle more. And most importantly, and this won't be popular with all of your farmers, eat less meat and dairy, because the largest carbon footprint of all the food that we consume is from animal, you know, livestock products, meat and dairy. So if you can cut the amount of meat and dairy that you eat, it doesn't mean everybody in your family has to become vegan or vegetarian, but just reducing portion sizes and cutting down on the amount that you eat can have a great contribution to reducing climate change.
Yes, or at least be more aware of how that cattle is produced and what sort of systems are behind.
Yes, but I would say eat less, no matter what system. That would be my advice.
Okay, great.
And it won't be popular with everyone.
I know that. We had a webinar just on that topic. But Viridiana, I don't want to leave one last question from Marin. She's asking, what are the challenges that Vera faced in implementing carbon credits, and how did you overcome these challenges?
Yeah, that's also a hard question to answer in 1 minute, but I will only focus it on the agriculture side, not in general on carbon credits. So big issue with the agriculture methodology so far has been that there's very little uptake. So we have a number of methodologies, but we don't have so many projects. And that relates, I believe, to the complexity of setting up these projects, also the high cost of monitoring in many cases. And the only thing we can do is like continue talking, right? Continue talking to people who try this, understand their challenges, and at the same time also talk with scientific experts on how some challenges could be addressed, what is credible, keep informing ourselves, what is the latest science, are there some options, and just continuous improvement. It's not like we can just solve things like this, and that's what makes it very exciting to work on this field. Sometimes we cannot meet all expectations, but we do our best.
Yeah, we feel that we are doing our part. That's also here at Food for Sustainability. We also feel that we are doing the part to contribute to a better planet. I will end the webinar here. Thank you so much for such an interesting conversation and for sharing your knowledge. You know, hope that we can meet again in the different conversation, different places to know, to share more of all your knowledge. To the participants that are still here with us, thank you so much. We'll be back again next week. This time we will focus more on the voluntary market for the carbon credits. So thank you so much. Have a nice week, and I'll see you next week. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Claudia. Bye.
Thank you, Claudia. Bye, everyone.